Hello, Biology 182 lab students. Today we'll be discussing Angiosperms, which is lab 31 on page 331 in your lab manual. These are the flowering vascular seed plants. In the top left-hand picture we can see an aster, kind of like a sunflower, with a skipper, which is very similar to a butterfly, that has a mutualistic relationship with flowers. This relationship is one of the reasons why angiosperms are so diverse. In the top middle picture showing a different type of flower, notice that this flower arrangement is more of a spike, accumulating the flowers at the top, where the asters each have their own stalk. In the top right are many different fruits, most of which we're familiar with: strawberries, kiwis, grapes, oranges, and so forth. In the bottom left-hand picture it shows entire trees that can have flowers. We see those in the spring. In the middle picture we see our familiar peanut. In the bottom middle picture we can see another type of sunflower. Something interesting about sunflowers is they're composites. So it's actually made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of smaller flowers, disc flowers, and ray flowers. In the bottom right-hand picture, a familiar cross-section of a kiwi. That looks delicious. And in our middle right picture we can see grasses, which are also angiosperms. In summary, angiosperms have been the dominant and most diverse and abundant land plants on Earth for the past 100 million years, founding many terrestrial ecosystems from grasslands to tropical forests. They are the only plants to make flowers and fruit, but share the traits of seeds, retain spores and vascular tissue with gymnosperms. The Monocots and Dicots are two major lineages within the phylum Epiphytes, which demonstrate two different sets of morphological adaptations to survival. Note, angiosperm, although it sounds like a taxonomic name, is a common name, but it means enclosed. Angio meaning seed and then sperm. Do not confuse the common name of this plant group with the phylum Epiphytes. Epiphyta means flowering plant. Pollinators have co-evolved with most angiosperms, facilitating pollination, which contributed to the success of angiosperms by increasing their chances of sexual reproduction. Fruits have also co-evolved with animal dispersers and provided another mechanism for the diversification of angiosperms. After female flower parts are fertilized, each ovule matures into a seed, and then the encompassing ovary matures into a fruit. Fruits evolve to protect and aid in the dispersal of seeds, the plant's offspring. The morphological diversity of fruit has evolved to facilitate dispersal by various mechanisms, including animal consumption and caching, wind, water, and self-propulsion. Off to the right, we can see two pictures. The top picture is a pollen transfer by animals, something like a sphinx moth or hummingbird moth. And in the bottom picture, we see fruits that disperse by wind carrying those filaments as drag forces and carrying that seed to various places away from the parent plant. Our objectives for Chapter 31 for our test are: 1. What are the derived and ancestral traits of the phylum Epiphytes? 2. What traits likely lead to the success of angiosperms? 3. What traits define the two major lineages of flowering plants, monocots and dicots? 4. What are the adaptive advantages of retained spores, protected seeds, and fruit? 5. How is the life cycle of angiosperms similar and different than that of gymnosperms and spore plants? And 6. When and from where do spores, seeds, and fruits develop? So what does the phylum Epiphytes include? Well, in the top left, they include fruit trees, and they can be deciduous and tropical. You're familiar with apple blossoms and apricot blossoms. In the top right, it also includes grasses. The flowers are very small, and we see them on the seed heads. Those flowers are typically used to make spore that's carried by wind. So many grasses use wind as a way of fertilization. In the bottom left, fruits and vegetables. So the same picture as before: grapes, kiwis, apples, oranges, All of those are included in Anthophyta. Vines, so grapes, are definitely included. And then the bottom right-hand picture, herbs and cacti are also included in Anthophyta. What are the size ranges in the phylum Anthophyta? So the smallest angiosperm is called the watermeal, the genus Wolffia, and it can be 1 millimeter in diameter. You can see a picture in the top right of some Wolffia that's on someone's finger. In the left-hand picture, in Australia, is a eucalyptus tree, which can be 100 meters high, 328 feet, the tallest angiosperm. Now remember, the redwoods in California are gymnosperms, and although they're taller, they're not included in this phylum. And then the largest flowers are called the Titanarum, and that belongs to the genus Rafflesia. And why do they smell like rotting flesh? To attract pollinators. But what kind of pollinators? We're talking about small beetles and flies that are attracted to carrion. These organisms are very small, and inside the Titanarum are many small flowers. And how it works is, the small beetle will crawl to the very bottom looking for carrion, feel a little duped, I'd imagine, not finding any carrion, and then crawl out of the flower collecting pollen. But that plant will have its female reproductive parts closed so it doesn't self-fertilize. And then that little beetle carrying pollen will be attracted to another flower where the male parts are now closed and the female parts are open, allowing fertilization. What is the evolution of flowering plants? One, they're most abundant and diverse land plants on Earth. Over 250,000 described species, and more species are described every year, especially in the tropical environments. There's 20,000 species of bryophytes, so comparatively we're talking about a 10-fold increase or more. And there's only about 800 species of gymnosperms, to give you perspective. And two, they arose around 140 million years ago in the Cretaceous period. They replaced conifers and ferns, and they dominate all terrestrial ecosystems on Earth except the alpine tundra, which of course is dominated by many bryophytes. We have a few pictures here. You can see in the top left picture our familiar aspen, which is a gymnosperm. In the top right, we can see many sunflowers dominating a grassland. In the bottom left, we can see Archaefructus. It's one of the earliest angiosperms in the fossil record. And in the bottom right, land prior to angiosperms, the lycophytes, ferns, and gymnosperms dominated the land. Charles Darwin thought the sudden appearance of flowering plants in the fossil record was an abominable mystery. Flowers, which are the reproductive organs of flowering plants, are the most remarkable feature distinguishing them from other seed plants. Flowers aid angiosperms by enabling a wider range of adaptability and broadening the ecological niches to open them. Flowers, along with other several traits, have contributed to the success of flowering plants, enabling them to largely dominate the terrestrial ecosystems that I mentioned before. Why is the phylum Anthophyta so successful? Well, one, they have morphological diversity, which means they have many different forms to occupy many different niches. That means they have a broad environmental tolerance, so we see them pretty much from the Arctic Circle all the way to the tropics. The seeds can withstand harsh conditions because they're protected by a fruit. Two, they co-evolved with animals, so there's many mutualistic relationships with insects, birds, and even bats. These pollinators increase sexual reproduction rates, and animal disperse the offspring via fruit. Three, they have efficient vascular systems. So these vessel elements that move water are called tracheids, and you can imagine moving several thousand gallons of water a day, seen in our eucalyptus tree, 100 meters, requires quite the efficiency of these vascular systems. Four, they have short generation time and a large seed set. So there's many more seeds produced per year, where conifers and gymnosperms required 1 to 3 years for a seed set. And then 5, the gametophyte generation is protected by the sporophyte. So we have a very large sporophyte organism encapsulating a gametophyte and protecting it. This ensures the maturation of the sex organs. Now let's discuss the derived traits of the phylum Anthracite. 1, flowers. Those are the sex organs. 2, fruit. So the ovules become seeds, the ovary becomes fruit tissue. Off to the right, we can see a diagram showing the fruit, the seed coats, the embryo, and the endosperm, which comprise the seed. 3, they have double fertilization, so there's 2 sperm. 1 sperm fertilizes the egg. The other sperm fertilizes the nutritive tissue. 3, they have a triploid nutritive tissue in seeds. So this 3N endosperm, which is food for the embryo, unlike the 1N tissue of gymnosperms. And this makes the seeds energy rich. And 5, they have advanced vessels to move water. These are similar to those found in cnidophytes. So now that we've talked about the derived traits, what are the ancestral traits of the phylum Anthracite? What are the ancestral traits that are retained in flowering plants? Let's take a look at our cladogram here. Let's get familiar with it. Off to the left, we can see Bryophytes, next to that ferns, and then Gymnosperms, which are the Carnivorous and Dicot, and then off to the right we see Angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. Let's start at the bottom. So we have this basic algal plant-like thing that has alternation of generations and protected embryos and sex organs. That gave rise to 2 groups, the Bryophytes, which have capsules, and then the other group. Now, this group are the ferns and the rest of the plants. Ferns have strobili, which we discussed earlier, but what trait helped plants stand tall? And what became the dominant life stage? Well, the development of wood would help plants stand tall with vascular tissue. And what became the dominant life stage? Well, of course, it's the sporophyte. And then, what disperses the offspring? Well, we have 2 choices here. Wind or sometimes mutualistic organisms. So, the gymnosperms, the conifers and the ginkgo, rely mainly on wind to pollinate each other. Whereas the angiosperms with flowers, they use flowers and fruit to have mutualistic relationships with insects, birds, and mammals to spread their seeds and to pollinate each other. Flowers are reproductive organs. Okay, so what are the female parts? Well, the female parts we call the pistil, and that's a collective organ system. It has a stigma, a style, and ovaries or carpels, and that's carpel is containing an ovary with ovules. The male parts we call the stamen. That's the organ system, and those are composed of anthers and filaments with pollen sacs, and those contain pollen grains. Pistils are divided into carpels. So each carpel has its own stigma, style, and ovary with ovules. So here's a question for you. How many carpels must this flower have? Now let's take a look at some other organs that we have on our flower. A petal. Petal is typically used to attract and guide a pollinator to the correct place so pollination can occur. Sepals are small leaf-like organs that originally encapsulated the entire petal system, protecting it. Then we have the receptacle, in which the entire flower sits. So question, why would most flowers evolve bright, showy petals? Anyone? Bueller? To attract pollinators. Bisexual flowers versus bisexual flowering plants. So there are several flower sexual conditions. In the top left diagram, we can see 3 drawings. We can have an all-female flower, which is carpellate or pistillate, and we only see the female parts. That's a type of imperfect flower. Off to the right-hand drawing, we can see an imperfect flower that's all male. We call that staminate. But the, quote, perfect flower is one that has both its bisexual and hermaphroditic. These flowers can, and sometimes do, pollinate themselves. Off to the right, there's many different types of plant sexual conditions. So we can have dioecious, where a plant will have only male flowers and only female flowers. Or, at the bottom drawing, we can see we'll have male flowers at the top and female flowers at the bottom, and occasionally a perfect flower forming at the bottom. We can see examples of these in our bottom photos. We can see an imperfect flower where we only see the female parts. We can see the perfect flower of the lily that has both, and then the right-hand picture we can see one that's staminate and only has male reproductive parts. Pollinators! Exclamation point. It's a lock and key relationship. So how's the interaction between pollinators of angiosperms a mutualistic relationship? Well, lock and key meaning the flower is typically designed to attract one to a few species of pollinators. So long corollas, which are many petals, built just for a hummingbird bill to go all the way down. Some are, like in the middle picture there, are built just for bees or flies to come into. And that right-hand picture is showing again a hummingbird going into the long corolla of scarlet gilia. In the bottom right-hand picture we have an upside-down flower built just for bats to come into. And then the bottom left-hand pictures, there are plants that trick pollinators. So some of these are insect-shaped, and birds will think that they can come down and eat them, and then they'll pollinate the flower, realizing they've been duped, that they don't have a meal. There's a video on pollination. I encourage you to check that out, and a video on plants that trick pollinators. So pollination is the transfer of pollen from male anthers of one flower to the female stigma of another, top of the pistil. So this gives rise to coevolution. Angiosperms and insects, along with birds and mammals, diversified together. What attracts pollinators to flowers? Well, of course, the flower color. They're color specific, so white flowers attract moths. Something along with that is many insects and birds and bats see in different wavelengths of light than we do. And you can take a white flower and it appears white to us through and through. But actually there's banding of pigments in which can be revealed in UV light, which many moths and bees can see. So what this does is it's beyond just the flower color, it's also a guide. Many flowers have a UV bullseye shape to guide the insect or other pollinator directly where it's supposed to go. Two, they have flower odor. Typically they're sweet to attract many different organisms, but some have rotting smells, as we mentioned with the giant Titan arum. Three, they have nectar guides. So these are special shapes allowing the pollinator to crawl right down inside of the flower along where they're supposed to go. They get covered in pollen, and then they, of course, drink their nectar and then fly to another flower to pollinate it. Four, they have landing platforms. So there are some flowers in South Africa that have special stems that allow sunbirds to grab a hold of them, which are hummingbird analogs, remembering that hummingbirds are not found in the Old World, they are strictly New World organisms. And these sunbirds grab this stem and are able to drink the nectar in such a way that they get pollen on their bills and then they fly to another flower. And of course the flower shape, we can have flowers mimic animals to attract predators to come down and pollinate them. How does sperm form in flowers? Well, pollen is the male gametophyte bearing sperm. So it itself is not a sperm cell alone. There's more to it. So in the top left-hand picture, we can see pollen are produced in pollen sacs. We can see these distinct sacs in the bottom left-hand picture, which we call microsporangia. You can see the filament in the middle and the pollen sacs are off to the side. In the right-hand diagram, we can see that same thing. You can see the filament in the middle that's containing a vascular bundle, of course, to give nutrients to these pollen sacs. And then we have these pollen mother cells, which are diploid. Then they go through meiosis, and then we get a tetrad of pollen, and then they separate, and we have 4 haploid pollen grains. How do eggs eggs form in flowers? Well, one, the ovary holds the female gametophyte, which produces one egg in each ovule. So we can see our diagram right there. We see the difference between the ovule and the ovary. Ovules become seeds after fertilization by the sperm. So we see the pistil, which is the entire thing, the ovule and the ovary, and then this diploid cell divides by meiosis once and then by mitosis 3 times. What that gives us are a few different cells. We get a couple of 2 polar nuclei, an egg cell, and a few other cells that help in feeding that egg cell once it is fertilized. And then, of course, it's surrounded by an embryo sac. Here's where things get really cool. Now, angiosperms have something called double fertilization. What does that mean? So, in the top left-hand picture, we can see pollen that's on the stigma. Stigmas usually have some sticky chemicals that allow the pollen grains to stick onto them. Alright, so what is double fertilization fertilize? Well, one sperm fertilizes an egg. We get a diploid zygote. And then 2, one sperm fertilizes the central cell of the ovule to form a triploid endosperm. And that's nutritive tissue. So let's take a look at our diagram in the bottom left. We can see the pollen grain. You see the stigma-style ovary, the central cell, which is 2N, the ovule, and then the egg nucleus. Now what happens to the pollen is, with the assistance of the female gametophyte, it grows something called a pollen tube. And this is directed by the tube nucleus. So within the pollen grain, we have a generative nucleus and a tube nucleus. Like I said, it's a gametophyte organism. A pollen grain itself is not just sperm. So, a pollen tube grows, as we can see, all the way around on an inverted ovary there. And within this tube, the sperm follow. One sperm fertilizes the central cell, giving that triploid endosperm. And then the other cell fertilizes the egg, giving a diploid zygote. In the right-hand picture, we can see the endosperm nucleus and the zygote and their relative positions to each other. Let's discuss the development of spores and the alternation of generations in gametophytes to sporophytes. So, let's take a look at a few parts to this diagram. The top left, development of a male gametophyte within the pollen grain. Okay, we got that part. And then B, we have the development of a female gametophyte in the embryo sac. Now the pollen grain first starts out as a microsporocyte and then microspores, and that's developed by meiosis. And then we have mitosis. Each of the 4 microspores can make a generative cell, will form 2 sperm. And then we have the male gametophyte, and that's the pollen grain itself. So the male gametophyte is surrounded by protein, and which many of us are allergic to. We can see the nucleus of the tube cell there, and then the nucleus of the generative cell, as I mentioned before. With the female gametophyte, we have the ovule that has a sporangium and a megasporocyte. And then that sporocyte goes through meiosis, and we have the surviving megasporocyte. The other ones are somewhat like polar bodies in human development of eggs. And then that surviving megasporocyte, or megaspore, goes through mitosis. And we can see the ovule there, and then we get that egg with many other cells. So that compromises the female gametophyte, those other cells and the egg inside of an embryo sac. So an ovule is an immature seed that holds 1 egg. The sporophyte generation, so spores that are retained and protected. And gametophyte generation, the gametophytes mature and produce gametes. Remember, gametophytes produce gametes, sporophytes produce spores. And then there's a key to the labels. The tan color means diploid, 2N, and then the gray color is haploid, meaning N. Let's discuss how a seed develops into a mature plant that has a flower, and how that flower becomes a fruit. You'll have to pardon the noises. Mr. Pippins is eating his dinner right now. He's chewing on some kibbles. Again, this isn't my stomach or anything, it's just Mr. Pippins. Down at the bottom is where I want to start. So, let's take a look at our zygote, kind of in the bottom right of our diagram here. So we have fertilization occur, we have the endosperm develop to give nutrients to the zygote. And then of course the zygote starts to develop into a sporophyte, which is our plants that we're used to. As it grows, the seed develops from the ovule, and we get a fruit that develops from the ovary. So, of course, we have birds and other animals that will eat this fruit and then spread the seed. And the seed falls out onto the ground and germinates. So now we can see roots and shoots beginning to grow out of the seed. The seed gives enough nutrients for the sporophyte to grow, but eventually those cotyledons are going to have to start doing photosynthesis to continue growth. Then we see the sporophyte seedling, then we get a mature sporophyte plant with flowers. That constitutes the mature plant, is when it has flowers. Now, we have our male and female parts, as we're familiar with, and we can have germinated pollen grain, the male gametophyte, on the stigma of the carpel. Then we're familiar with our anther at the tip of the stamen. We are familiar with the pollen tube growing down the carpel, and then depositing a couple of sperm, and the sperm find the egg and the endosperm cells, thus causing fertilization. So, a couple of questions to think about. What's the difference between an ovule and an ovary? And the other one, how many sperm are needed to fertilize 20 ovules? Alright, so let's go over the life cycle summary of phylum Anthophytum. So number one, the male pollen grains form within the sporangia of anthers and are released. 2, the eggs are formed in ovules within the ovary. 3, pollination occurs, pollen grain reaches the stigma. 4, the pollen tube grows down the style to an ovule, transferring 2 sperm. 5, double fertilization. So those are the production of a diploid zygote and a triploid endosperm, which is food for the embryo and a seedling growth. And 6, we have a zygote that turns into an embryo, which turns into a seed, and then it germinates, and we have a young sporophyte, a diploid plant that begins the process all over again. Think of embryos like eggs. So these embryos are protected and nourished in seeds, just like eggs of a chicken. So, number one, developing embryo digests the endosperm for energy, just like a chicken uses the yolk for energy. 2, grows until it fills the seed, and that's mature. Now, at this point, the endosperm is depleted, and many seeds can go into a dormant phase here, where they're primed and ready, sometimes for years. Like in the Namib Desert, there are many seeds that don't see water except for every 10 years, and then they immediately germinate. 3, the seed has 3 components. Seed coat, so that's going to help protect the actual embryo from desiccation. And then we're going to have a food supply, so that's the triploid endosperm and the embryo itself. And then 4, it allows the embryo to remain dormant. Of course, seeds can only be dormant for so long in a dry environment. However, some seeds, when frozen, can remain dormant for thousands of years. In fact, last year, a 9,000-year-old plant that actually does not exist to this day was grown from deposits in the Arctic. So there's 5 main stages of embryo development. There's the proembryo, and that's the zygote to embryo, basal cell, suspensor, and proembryo. 2, there's the globular phase, has radial symmetry, little internal organization. There's the heart-shaped phase, has bilateral symmetry, cotyledon development, and tissue differentiation. And then there's the torpedo phase, that's the elongation of the cotyledon and the root. And then the 5, is the mature seed. There's large bent cotyledons, a radicle is formed, and the endospore is depleted. Vessel elements are a derived trait of angiosperms. These very efficient vessel elements. The first one I'd like to discuss are tracheids. They're less efficient. They belong to all vascular plants. The cells are narrower, and the cells lie side to side. You can see in our middle diagram there. They're less efficient because they transport water mostly horizontally through pits. These pits actually have a window on them, an aperture which can open and close depending on the plant's need for water. If it's going through a period of drought, it can close those pits. But the vessel elements that are advanced in the angiosperms only, the cells are very wide. Their cells are attached end to end, like in the left diagram, and they're 100 times more efficient. So they transport water vertically like a straw. However, there still is side-to-side movement of water. Say that if a plant were to have a vessel element damaged, this allows for the percolation of the water to move to another vessel element and begin its way upward. Finally, we get to the monocots, a major lineage of angiosperms. Let's talk about their traits that makes monocot a monocot. One, they have one cotyledon, so one embryonic leaf per seed. Two, they have flower parts in sets of 3 or 6. 3, they have parallel leaf venation, meaning their veins in their leaf run parallel. We can see that in the bottom left picture. 4, they have a fibrous root system. Take a look at the oat fibrous root as it runs down into the ground. And 5, they're never woody, so they don't have proper wood. At the top right, we can see a picture of a palm tree. It seems like wood. It's something like wood, but not the same chemical components that we classify as wood. They have 6 stamens, typically 3 petals or 6 petals, 3 sepals or 6 sepals, and a 3-lobe stigma or a 6-lobe stigma. We see these in lilies, grasses, and even agaves. Dicots, another major lineage of angiosperms. So what's the difference between monocots and dicots? Number 1, dicots have 2 cotyledons per seed. So di meaning 2, cots meaning cotyledons. 2, they have flower parts in sets of 4 or 5 or many. So we're familiar with 4 or 5 like the 4 o'clock, 5 like our columbine down in the bottom left hand corner, or many like a rose. 3, they have reticulate venation, which means it's going to expand away from a central place like in our maple leaf there and spread out somewhat like our veins do. They have a taproot, so the bottom middle picture we can see a taproot rather than that fibrous system of the oat plant. And some are woody, so we'll actually have some wood. So all woody angiosperms are dicots. Many of them are deciduous trees, but beans, roses, and carrots are examples of other dicots. You'll have to forgive me. Mr. Pippins is sitting here with me. He insists on sitting on my lap right now. Right, Mr. Pippins? So if there's any weird noises, that's just my sweet little puppy, okay? In summary, monocots versus dicots. If we take a look at our monocotyledon, which is corn, we can see a seed coat, the endosperm, a single cotyledon, a leaf sheath, first true leaves, the embryonic root. We see on our developing plant the first leaf, the leaf sheath. We see parallel veins and fibrous roots. Now let's take a look at our dicotyledon, which is our bean in this case. We can see inside the seed coat, the first true leaves, meaning 2 cotyledons, an endosperm, and then we look at our small germinating plant. We still have the 2 cotyledon leaves. We see a taproot system, and if we look at the maturing plant, we see that taproot system develop even more, net-like veins, and those withering cotyledons typically are not kept once the plant matures further. There's a couple of videos. Take a look at the monocot germinating versus the dicot germinating. Since we're familiar with seeds on the inside of a fruit, how do fruits form and protect seeds? Well, one, The fruit is a matured ovary and it has a thickened wall. 2. After the ovules are fertilized with pollen, the ovary wall thickens as the seed develops inside it. And 3. Seeds are protected by the mature ovary wall, the fruit, which becomes either a fleshy fruit or a dry fruit. So in the top right corner we can see some acorns. That's an example of a dry fruit. And then a fleshy fruit, you can see a picture of a pumpkin in the bottom right hand picture. Now let's take a look at our pea plant here. We've got an ovary wall, we've got the stigma, we've got the ovule, and then the fruit itself surrounding those seeds. How are fruits adapted to disperse seeds? Well, number 1, which we are very familiar with, are sweetened fruits. Those are eaten by many different organisms, some reptiles, birds, even some amphibians, mammals, many fish, many insects, arthropods in general. They're going to eat them and then disperse those seeds in their droppings. Or we can have many birds like our raven that lives here in Flagstaff that will cache some fruit. So they'll find a nice big apple and then they'll bury it under some soil and then they forget about it. Although ravens are very good at remembering where their caches are. But if they forget about it for too long, it'll germinate. 2, we have aerodynamic fruits. Those are winged seeds. So we can see a picture of our winged seeds from our dandelion as they float in the wind. 3, we can have clingy fruits like cockleburs seen on that person's sock. I think those were deliberately placed there. It looks far too neat. Whenever I get cockleburs on my sock, they're usually quite bound into the cotton fibers of my sock. 4, floating fruits. So, like the coconut in the bottom right-hand picture, float very well in the sea and find a new beach, and high tide will place it further on the beach where it can germinate. And then explosive fruits like the witch hazel seeds. They actually fire out of the former flower, out of the fruit, and can fire at upwards of 10 meters per second, which is quite fast, quite the explosion. So why is it important that seeds are dispersed? We have 3 types of fleshy fruit. And remember, a fruit is a matured ovary. So we have simple fruits, which are one ovary in one flower matures into drupes, pomes, and berries. We have an aggregate fruit. Many ovaries in one flower mature into many simple fruits connected by a receptacle, like strawberries and raspberries. And then we have multiple fruits. Many ovaries in clustered flowers. These are pineapples and mulberries. We can see off to the right examples of those. So a simple fruit would be an apple. We can see the apple flower and the apple fruit. And then we can see our aggregate fruit. We can see our strawberry there as it's developing with many seeds on the outside. And then a multiple fruit. We can see those many ovaries clustered in flowers in our pineapple. Become familiar with these types of fleshy fruit. They're defined by organization of carpels, ovules, and single fruits. So a berry is like a tomato. Yes, a tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable. We can see an aggregate like a raspberry or a blackberry. A pepo like a cucumber. A drupe is a peach. Hesperidium is an orange. And a pome is like an apple. Now let's look at types of dry fruit. And based on their morphology, how would you guess each is dispersed? So we have capsules, like the cocklebur. A samara, like the winged box elder seeds. Legumes, like the big noni in the top right. We have nuts, like acorns and almonds. And those fruits include a shell. And then achenes, which are with our familiar dandelion and other asters that use the wind to carry their small parachute-like seeds. Angiosperm ecology. So we need to review the next slides on your own at home. That's what these online lectures are all about. And learning about the many ways that angiosperms have adapted to survive in a variety of habitats from water to deserts. In the bottom right-hand picture, we can see our larkspur being pollinated by our sphinx moth, common here in Flagstaff. Aquatic angiosperms. They're adapted to live in water, which has less oxygen, and sunlight. Sunlight only penetrates so deep. They typically have a thin cuticle, so there's no need to prevent water loss. The leaves directly diffuse water, so they have smaller roots, which is a wonderful adaptation. They have air sacs, of course, photosynthetic parts that float at the surface so they can be as close to the sunlight, pure sunlight, without having any filter from the water. They have aerated roots. They enable oxygen diffusion. And they have dispersal by waterfowl and boats. And many are invasive and non-natives. So in the top right picture we can see a lily pad. We commonly think of the lily pad as a good thing, where frogs sit on it. However, in many parts of the world, the lily pad is actually quite an invasive species. We can see the middle picture there. We have our cattail, which are a native species to Arizona and are being outgrown and outcompeted by a European reed called Phragmites. So whenever you see some cattails, that means that's a very healthy ecosystem. In the bottom right-hand picture, we can see a leopard frog that's surrounded by duckweed. And duckweed can actually be quite invasive and choke many slow-moving streams so that oxygen is not in the water because it's not being aerated by turbulent flow. How about succulent angiosperms? Succulent meaning very fleshy. So these typically grow in dry climates. We're familiar with these in Arizona. We have many prickly pears, agaves, and our state plant, the saguaro cactus. They're efficient for water storage, so they have less surface area to lose water from, hence being fleshy, and they have thicker stems and leaves for that reason. They limit water loss, so they have fewer stomata. They have sunken stomata to keep the air current very still around the stomata. They have spines and ribbed stems that provide shade and limit wind exposure. And then many of them have crassulacean acid metabolism involved in photosynthesis, which is a wonderful way to capture carbon at night and allow stomata to be closed during the day. Some of our species that we can see here of our succulent, we have Hawthornia, agave, frithia, euphorbia, and all of these species, they're found throughout the world, but remember, cacti are a New World plant. We do not find cacti in Africa, Asia, and Europe and Australia. Saprophytic and parasitic angiosperms are an interesting group. Some acquire nutrients from fungus, so they lack chlorophyll, and they're typically white or gray, such as seen in the Indian pipe plant. Now, these access the hyphae from fungus and steal nutrients into their roots. Saprophytes feed off dead or decaying organic matter. There are some orchids and pine drops, but I want you to remember there are no true saprophytes in the world. So what happens is a appearing saprophytic plant will be next to many fungus and again will leach the nutrients from the fungus that's already decaying that organic matter. So in many ways they are not saprophytic but more parasitic. And then parasites feed off of another plant entirely. So we can have some like the Indian paintbrush that will grow off the roots of a tree. And some orchids grow directly off of the branches of a tree and steal many of the nutrients needed for their growth. And mistletoes are a very serious problem here on our juniper trees. As you drive down by Sedona, you'll see many big clusters of orange-looking balls inside of a juniper tree. Those are the mistletoes, and they are parasitic and actually posing quite a problem for our juniper population in Arizona. Epiphytes are a very unique group of angiosperms that can grow on very tall trees in rainforests. So they're plants that grow above the ground non-parasitically on other plants. We call these air plants. And they're able to photosynthesize and make sugars, and they obtain their nutrients from the air. Anchor roots into host plant, but no nutrition is passed between them. They obtain water, especially in the rainforest, just from catching rain or cloud moisture. And some roots grow down to the soil. So bromeliads, which you can see in a commonly found grocery store, they'll have roots that will go all the way from a branch of a tall rainforest angiosperm all the way to the ground. We see this in orchids, vines, and even strangler figs. Strangler figs are a unique group of plants that can actually produce roots that will strangle the plant that they're growing on, thus killing it. An interesting fact, many epiphytes, like bromeliads, collect enough water that these water sources can be used by many poison dart frogs to lay their eggs into and develop their tadpoles. An interesting group of angiosperms are the carnivorous type. They typically grow in soils poor in nutrients. So what they do to compensate for those nutrients is they supplement it by digesting animals, such as flies or beetles, but they still do photosynthesis to make sugar. They have many different types of traps. So they have pitfall traps, like the pitcher plants we see in the bottom left-hand picture. They trap prey in a rolled leaf that contains a pool of digestive enzymes and bacteria. Flypaper traps use sticky mucilage, we can see in the top right-hand picture. Snap traps utilize rapid leaf movements, such as the Venus flytrap. Bladder traps suck prey in with a bladder that generates an internal vacuum. And lobster pots, in the bottom right-hand picture, force prey to move towards a digestive organs with inward-pointing hairs. In Arizona, we do have invasive and exotic angiosperms, which can be quite harmful to the ecosystems. Tamarisks and Russian olives have altered riparian areas in the western U.S. The problem with these versus the coyote willow and other native riparian plants is they draw up too much water and release it into the atmosphere, thus draining many rivers like the Colorado. Cheatgrass, red brome, and buffalo grass are serious problems because they have disrupted fire regimes in the western U.S. The Mojave Desert did not usually burn very well because there was many rocks in between the cacti and small grasses. But now cheatgrass grows in between those, seen in the bottom right-hand picture, and those can cause fire to spread from Joshua tree to Joshua tree, which has not been seen before in these ecosystems. What are our current threats to angiosperms, many of which you can guess? Pathogens, so we can have fungal diseases such as sudden oak death, Dutch elm disease, and chestnut blight. You see that in the top right-hand picture. Invasive insects, like the emerald ash borer in the top left-hand picture. The gypsy moth caterpillar, seen in the right middle picture. The Asian longhorn beetle, and the cactus moth. And then aspen decline. We see that here in our mountains. For multiple factors, one being the changing of soil components, climate change, loss of pollinators, and the loss of the rainforest. Deforestation in the rainforest truly is a tragedy because most of the angiosperm biodiversity is found in the rainforests around the world, and unfortunately many of these areas are being destroyed to obtain wood to basically make charcoal so people can have fires to cook food and various other things out of these rare angiosperms. Many angiosperms are used for cultural uses. This is kind of a statement of the obvious, but what we use them for are medicinal and pharmacological reasons. Many of the drugs you take were originally found in plants, especially the angiosperms. So in the bottom left-hand picture we have Navajo, or called Hopi tea. And this plant can be used to make a special tea. Of course, corn or maize is domesticated from teosinte a grass in Mexico which can be ground up using a metate, seen in the bottom middle picture, and used to make flour and breads. Mesquite is another seed that can be used to make flours or breads. And the top right-hand picture, of course, to our state, the saguaro, is very important, and also to the natives, being used for religious and cultural purposes. Looking at pharmaceuticals, many plants have chemical properties that are used for medicinal uses. These can lead to cures for cancers and other diseases. This is a very lucrative industry. Can be more than $40 billion per year. There is a problem though. Many rare plants are used in health fads and can be over-harvested. So many Chinese and Indian, even European cultural uses will over-harvest a plant for a religious purpose, not knowing what type of chemicals are in them and how they could be used to prevent or cure diseases. And this presents a problem when deforesting many angiosperms, leaching of chemicals into the water table. So these plants act like a filter. We can see some of these effects of leaching metals into the water, especially like our little leopard frog there, growing many different legs, probably from an overdose of selenium. And there's two pictures below. One, I like the art form of the pills composing the person. One thing that I always recommend is know what you're taking. So if you're taking some sort of medicinal supplement and it says some plant on it, go ahead and research that out. Because if it's not approved by the FDA, then perhaps it might have some side effects that you're not aware of. Some very beautiful angiosperms we can find in Arizona. The top left picture is a monocot, is the sago lily, which is also Utah's state flower. We can see our saguaro cactus, which is very important for us culturally, but also to the ecosystem of the Sonoran Desert. We can see native grape that does grow around in our forests here around Flagstaff, and the grapes are edible once they're ripe. I don't suggest eating a green grape. In the top right, we can see our desert shooting star. Typically we find these in the desert and in high elevations, usually surrounded by water in a wetland. In the bottom left is a scarlet monkey flower. We can find these blooming on the rocks in the middle of Oak Creek Canyon. And a desert agave, which is our Arizona agave, very unique to this state. In the bottom right is our Arizona sycamore. Check out the Deaver Herbarium in Biology Room 313 to learn more about or take the native plants class with Dr. Tina Ayers.
Changing places, falling down over me. Memories losing faces, you surround what's left of me. Time still rolling traces, what's been ground out of me. Still recall the taste and sweetness sound and what's to be. I know and you know too what I've left behind. For you, it's not easy being angels wingless, left lying on the ground.